Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here, and we're talking tonight about dinner mode, so a little bit about technology addiction, a little bit about food access, a little bit together, and sort of invite you to come on a journey with me. So I start with a question, and the question that weaves through as we're talking for the next 20 minutes or so is, how do we balance being online with being offline in our everyday lives? There's a few ways that I've thought about it, and I'm breaking it up into a few different conversation points. And all of this I use I encourage you to think of sort of fodder, so if we have questions in the Q&A or things afterwards that you want to know about. But when I was incubating this idea for a movement that I wanted to launch, I looked at a few different specific categories and then went really deep into doing some research, studies, articles, what was going on, and things that I felt as they started to come together. That's when dinner mode emerged for me. So it was almost like I backed into it in some ways, as there were some conversations and some topics that I was continually having with friends, with colleagues, with my family. And the first one I'll start with is addicted. So, my statement or purpose around this is we are addicted to our devices. We are constantly connected. They say that the average smartphone user checks their phone 53 times a day. I think for nonprofit marketers or for, that's a lot more. They say that the average 59% of the average smartphone user checks their phone first thing in the morning when they wake up. And what kind of things are this causing for us? There's a Disney World study that I only found out about after I actually launched DinnerMode, and people would sort of write or come up to me and say, here's some other things that I found. So I find this to be so troubling and fascinating at the same time. Walt Disney World hired a few social anthropologists, Harvard-trained HBS writers. Actually, the article is on HBR. And they asked them to come into Disney World, and they wanted to see what young kids were most fascinated by. Because as you can imagine, they wanted to do more of that. Was it some kind of food? Was it something with Frozen and Elsa? Was it a ride? Was it like a yellow brick road? And they went in and they were monitoring and looking at children for a period of time. And the number one thing that they came away with that the children were most fascinated by, their parents' cell phones. Which gives me chills when I think of it, these little kids. But kids look up to you and you're looking at your phone. And so they only want to mimic the things that you're doing. And so this idea of what's happening to us with this constant surge of information in our hands was very troubling to me, is very troubling to me. And there are a lot of things about technology that I love. I make my living on the internet, early adopter to social media because I loved that idea of connecting with people. I've lived in a lot of different cities. I've traveled internationally and worked, with NGOs, and I like the idea that someone I met in the Congo or the Philippines or Ghana or Haiti or somewhere that I can stay connected with, and I can use the internet to do that in a way that we couldn't do 10, 20, 50, 100 years ago in the same way. But at the same time, it does have something to it. So this isn't about throwing away technology and saying I'm not using it anymore. I look at it as an awareness of what are we doing to ourselves, what are we doing to our society, and certainly what's happening to the next generation and our children. So the next kind of big topic that I came to was this concept of being present, and that we are not living in the moment when we're always rushing to the next thing. In the last decade alone, according to a Pew Research study, the average salaried worker is working 47 hours a week. I know a lot of us, especially in New York, would say that we're working a lot more than that, but in a nationwide study, which might not seem like a lot, but it is 6 to 7 hours more than just a decade ago. For non-salaried workers, for a lot of us that work with nonprofits, that work with a lot of populations that are on an hourly, it's actually over 50 hours. It's about 52 and a half. So that's, if you think about it, that's a day and a half. That's an entire day and a half extra that people are working. Benjamin Franklin famously split his day into 3 chunks. of 8 hours, 8 for sleeping, 8 for working, and 8 for being with friends and family and creating and doing things. Where does this extra time working come from? Which of those hours, right? And what happens when we're spending so much more time working? What are we getting from it on the other side? And if we're working so much more, how are we tracking and measuring it? I really looked very deeply to try and find one way, and there isn't one way, but is it the time you count sitting at your computer? Or is it the time that you're checking your phone in Starbucks when you're waiting 3 minutes for a coffee, because heaven forbid you spend 3 minutes alone, or on the subway, or you're walking down the street, or in that morning time when you're checking? What counts, right? So there are a lot of different numbers that I found, and I think the numbers skew a lot higher, and I think it's terrifying. I think it's terrifying that we're spending so much more time working and that we don't necessarily know how to shut off. I know a ton of people who say, I don't do a good job shutting off. I'm always connected. I'm always around. So then when you're in the moments that matter, how do you get yourself there if you're constantly training your brain to do the opposite? If you're constantly training yourself to multitask and to do lots of different things, how can we get to our place where we're actually really present and in the moment that we're in? So the next topic that really came to mind that I wanted to learn more about as this was all tying in was this concept of sparking creativity. So we need to spend time away from technology to recharge our systems. There was a fantastic New York Times article this summer called "Steve Jobs Was a Low-Tech Parent." And it had a number of tech leaders from Facebook, Yahoo, Twitter, etc., including Apple. And it talked about how a lot of our makers of technology limit the screen time for their children. And so maybe that means that they're in a Waldorf system where there's no technology at all for early education. Maybe it means that when they're home, they're not allowed to have constant iPads and TVs and smartphones in front of them. But what I found really interesting about this piece was a few things. We talk a lot about hacking productivity. We talk a lot about how do you get to a place where you can be creative again. But when I was, thinking about the makers of technology, I almost felt like they owed the rest of us an oath. They're the ones making it, and yet they're making this conscious decision not to let their children use it all the time. But the consumers of technology don't have that same thing. There isn't the same conversations. And there are a ton of kids that are placated by being handed a device. Furthermore, if we're having all of these conversations and articles about children, where's the conversations about what it's doing to ourselves? So there's a concept I find really interesting that's a balance of your screen time between creating and consuming. And the idea is that if you're creating, you're doing an app, you're doing, you're coding, you're writing, you're doing something that's a creation, that can be unlimited time. If you're consuming, which is anything other than, so texting, your social media, you're watching television, then that can be a limited time. And I don't think that there should be necessarily an hour set, or that's not my place to dictate. But I know that as I was diving into this, I started really thinking about my time a lot differently. Am I creating or am I consuming? And so the next concept that really came to me as a conversation that I was constantly having with people that was sort of tied in is this concept of abundance. So we aren't appreciating what we're consuming. We have such a movement right now towards locavore and farm to table and healthy food. And there's a lot to be said for having healthy food, but increasingly families are not sitting down together at dinner. The average family is sitting together about twice a week, right, for dinner at night. And the studies show, there was a study that said that families that sit down together an average of 3 times a week, the kids will have better grades, less dependence on alcohol, better interpersonal relationships, potentially be eating better, so there's lower obesity, there could be lower type 2 diabetes, certainly in inner city populations where the risk is so incredibly high, better education around nutrition, again that lowering sugar, like the big bad sugar, that's attacking all of us. Conversely, the opposite is true. There's a lot of studies around kids that are not eating with their families. They aren't in school as much. Their grades are worse. They might not be going past high school education. Obesity is higher. Type 2 diabetes is higher. So, sometimes you see one and the other necessarily isn't true, but in the case of food and what's happening with our country with food, there is a lot that can be said. And I also think the same is true for busy single New Yorkers who eat by themselves, for people who don't have children. It's not one universal that it has to be one way. And so for a lot of my friends, they might say we're always rushing, we don't give ourselves time to sit down and eat, or we make ourselves a nice meal, but then we sit and I'm reading on the iPad news, or I'm on my phone, or I'm watching TV, and I'm not really just eating what I'm eating. And so sort of what happens with that. And there's some nonprofits, there's certainly some groups that deal with that. There's something called the Dinner Project out of Harvard that recently partnered with Cheerios to do something called the Breakfast Project, so it's on the other side, but and obviously it's branded, so it has that tie into Cheerios, but it was that idea of start your day, eating together as a family and have a conversation, and what can that do for family strength. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself, and we'll get into the movement. But as I was going through these places and these concepts to give you a sense of who I am, I consider myself an activist, humanitarian, whatever that might be, a writer, digital marketer, burgeoning farmer, which I'll get to in just a moment, a little bit more. I've been blogging online since 2005. I launched The Cosmopolitan, which is partially a blog and some consulting, in 2008. Last year I released a manifesto called the Giving Manifesto, which can be downloaded for free on my site. So if you'd like to, it's a nod to the Holstein Manifesto. I have a lot of projects that I do because I love projects, and one of them, I read 52 books a year. Doesn't necessarily net to one a week, but it's pretty close, and I post them all on my blog since 2008. I have all the books that I've read, and a couple of other big campaigns that sometimes people have heard of, sometimes not, but I had a Cause It's My Birthday campaign in 2008, raised $20,000 for malaria nets in Ghana, a Gulf Coast benefit. I lived in New Orleans for a while and did a lot around the oil spill and post-Katrina work. Noalicious came from that as well. Once a year I take a trip to a developing country, mostly with a nonprofit that I'm working with, an advisor to, or board member of, which there's a few. And so, every year I go and we'll do some kind of big fundraiser and big trip. So I have a lot of different ways that I'm thinking about how the world is shifting and how it's changing and how we can do our part to make it better. So if someone has seen me in the last handful of years, I would say 2008 and on, likely it was in a capacity similar to this. Some speaking, some conference going. There were a lot of different places where I felt like that's me, that's the things that I'm doing. And there's interspersed, obviously, with spending time abroad, with working in developing countries, but I sort of mostly pictured myself in some capacity like this. And then, at least for me, one day everything changes. So the man on the left is Nathan Winters, and he's a dear friend of mine, one of the great loves of my life. On the right is his wife, Eliza, and that's their daughter, Matilda, in the middle. Eliza's pregnant with a baby, you can't see in this photo. And Nathan is someone who I traveled cross country with a few times. We both worked in startups in LA for a couple of years, and we went our separate ways. We both got married. We sort of have had our own families. We always were very close, and he's a very, very close friend of mine, someone I consider family. On April 28th, he sustained serious accidents on a farm that he was working on and died. He had decided to become a farmer after going through this very wonderful self-journey around food and around where food is coming from, and having a tech and digital background like a lot of us do, and me as well. And I remember his mom being like, I didn't raise you to be a farmer. I'm not sure how I feel about that. And he was adamant. He was adamant that he was going to leave technology behind. Of course, not completely, because he built a great website for their farm, Hill Hollow Farm, which is in Petersburg, New York, about 3.5 hours north of here. Was really great at marketing a CSA to get members, at having a social media presence, of writing for some online farming publications. So he still leveraged his digital skills, but had kind of come to this place where he said, food is the most important thing that's happening to me. And when he passed away, I felt like I wanted to do something more for his family than simply make a donation to the GoFundMe that raised $45,000 in the days that followed, or go to the funeral, the memorial service. I felt like he was such a big part of my life that I needed to do something more to help. It came out at the time that Eliza was pregnant, and so the idea of fulfilling that obligation for a CSA seemed very overwhelming. So I pitched my husband on this idea of going up to the farm for the summer. Most of my clients were remote. I took some of them off my plate and ended up spending the better part of 6 weeks on the farm. And so the photos of me became very different. And while I was up there, it was really hard to be connected all the time to your device, almost impossible, and actually not that fun. It was really fun to leave your phone like in the shed and go out and pick green beans, collect eggs, feed the pigs, harvest, weed, bale hay, build fences, remove fences. And as a full working farm, I had no farming experience. I mean, I grew up on a cul-de-sac in Pittsburgh. We had landscapers. I've lived in like, LA, New Orleans, and New York, not necessarily the best places for having a garden or even a backyard. And so I had no experience whatsoever. But as I was doing this, it was really interesting because I was like so appreciative of the food. I've gone to farmers markets for 10 plus years, but I never really thought about like, where does it come from beyond buying it at the farmers market and choosing to live sort of in this healthy, sustainable way. And so if I was picking green beans, which are one of the least fun, laborious, like time task, that's like what you give the newbie. That's what I learned. Like, you give me the green beans because I don't know any better. And then when I was cooking at night, because we were mostly cooking from seconds or things we got from the farm that weren't going into the CSA shares, the food was so good that my husband and I were like, eating slower, like paying more attention, and then therefore having almost better conversation because we were so connected to the food that we were having. And I was spending hours and hours of time in the fields by myself working on a task and had a lot of time to think about some of those other categories that we talked about. So somewhere along the way, I had this aha moment. What if there was a movement to challenge people to put down their phones and appreciate the food that they're eating and appreciate the people that they're eating it with, their friends, their family, by themselves, in a restaurant or at home, and create this sort of movement that I called DinnerMode. And so I put together a lot of different concepts and decided that what I would do is launch DinnerMode pretty simple and pretty quick and without a huge budget. I've worked with large organizations and small and for-profit, nonprofit, done it a lot of different ways. One of the things that I thought was really cool for myself was that, we have the freedom to do that. If you know a little bit of coding, you can put together a website, you can put together what you want. And I wanted to do something that I felt was simple and could pick up steam and I could get feedback on and could grow from there. And so as I was launching DinnerMode, I was talking to local farmers, going to some farming conferences that happen this summer, talking to some people who do farm to table, some chefs, people like at Stone Barns, the Young Farmers Conference, James Beard Foundation, and there are a couple of other organizations and groups that certainly do disconnect on certain days, once a year, digital detox. There's a lot of those kinds of concepts. But for me, one of the parts that I was really focused on is a few universal truths. One, when I'm on my phone, it's important. When you're on your phone, it's annoying, which I think everyone would agree with. and another, that we could take back this idea of our technology. We could take back this idea of how much we're using our devices and change it, and maybe change it within our organizations. There's an agency called Edelman, and Edelman Canada, not the US, mind you, but Edelman Canada sets a rule where anything that comes in between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m. doesn't have to be responded to. Which is pretty, unless it's like a fire or something crazy that's happening. But for a company to set that kind of culture and that kind of policy, I think really says a lot about how their employees are going to be with their devices. That's sparking creativity, that abundance piece, that how we're doing productivity. There's a German car maker, Daimler, and they have a policy where when you go on vacation and you set your out of office, you say who things should come into. So I'm not in, if you need something, talk to this person, this is when I'm back in the office. And then those emails get deleted. So when your jaw just dropped. So when you're away and you're cheating and you're checking your phone even though you're supposed to be on vacation, they're not there. And when you get back, your inbox is clear. For Germans, I think this is pretty amazing. So, so there was a lot around companies, and so I think for me, this concept of dinner mode, I felt like, yes, we can talk a lot about meditation and mindfulness. Certainly, Arianna Huffington, Russell Simmons, they have books on meditation. There's a lot of movement around detoxing from our phones, detoxing from the busyness of our lives, but I really wanted to take a stance around something that universally we all do, which is eat. So if we could start with this concept of paying attention while we're eating and putting down our devices, could it extend into other parts of our lives? Could it extend into the time that we're spending with friends and family? If we have workplaces where we can enact policies or be part of the change, could we bring up these types of conversations? I think that it's huge to talk about how we're using our relationship with technology, and I personally feel like tying it to something like food, which crosses race and class and gender and part of the country and urban and rural, it connects with everybody. And so I created a challenge, and it's pretty simple for right now, though I will say there's an app and some other cool things in the works. But right now I just say for anyone who wants to try it, and it seems simple, which is meant to be simple, but I have had a lot of people say to me that they think it's hard. They sit down with friends and family and somebody else wants to break it. So I will say that, that it's one of those things where maybe it's a little bit easier than you think it is. Set a timer. I say 15 minutes, 30, 45. They say if you've never meditated, start with 5 minutes. So, it's that kind of thing. Start where you can. Turn your phone down. Eat. Refresh, refuel, and then celebrate when you do it. And I find it to be very hard. My mother-in-law, who is the nicest, sweetest woman, who they barely got smartphones anyway, told me this was like incredibly hard because a text comes in and she feels like she has to respond. A high-powered New York CEO woman that I know has 2 small children, and she said it was incredibly hard because the children are there, and when one of them starts to kind of get a little agitated, they've always just sort of handed them a device. Or, a lot of people say this just isn't something that I can do. But I look at it like if we could just spend 15, 30, 45 minutes a day where we're without our devices, what could this start to do to sort of change us and change our attitudes? So if you'd like more information, there's more up at DinnerModeorg. It's DinnerMode on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest, etc. And building out what the movement looks like in 2015, which is pretty exciting. So there's a lot in the works that I could maybe talk about more a little bit later. But it was something that I felt Dinner Mode has come from such a deep and personal place of loss and feeling that I wanted to take something that happened this year and move it in a direction of the things that I've learned and the concepts that I was thinking about and some of the research that I mentioned and found. And I just wanted to capsulate it into a place where I felt like I could release it into the world and share it. So I want to thank everybody so much for paying attention and for listening. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to tweet me, to email me, to come up and talk to me here. And I just want to say thank you so much. So Does anyone have any questions? Comments?
Stories about how you
Yeah.
So what about the people that are the foodies that take the technology into the social space where they all sit down around dinner and they're all taking pictures of their food, they're all discussing and journaling all about their experience that evening. Obviously that's a social friendly experience. It's not family kind of. What do you say about obviously balancing and you're very busy, and I actually want to ask you, with all the things that that you're involved with, it seems like your life must be so lopsided as well to run through all of this. So what do you say about the first one, and then how do you balance your day?
Yeah. So first, I don't mean this is an insult to food bloggers, but not everyone's a food blogger, right? Like not everybody, like I'm sorry, you don't really need a photo of every meal that you've had. We lived for like millennium without it. So I found that I used to do that, like take a photo, and now if I really feel like I have to, I take a photo of the empty plate before I start dinner. That's like my little hack to get me through it. So I have a lot of photos now of just like before I've started dinner. But so that's one. I mean, I think it's just an understanding of what is it about. I do want to reference, there was a really interesting article that came out a few months ago about a restaurant that was trying to figure out why their profits had gone down, and they were like, they couldn't figure it out over the last couple of years. Did you see this? Yeah. So they couldn't figure out what it was, and they were like, is it our food costs? It wasn't. You know, is it the transportation costs? Not really. Is it workers' salaries? Not really. So it turns out what they realized was the actual time of a turnover for a table had increased, because over the past handful of years, people are sitting longer at the table. They're looking at their phones. They're not looking at the phones at the table because they know that that's bad, but they're sneaking to the bathroom and looking at the phones. So then the food doesn't come until everyone's seated, right? So it turns out that, I mean, chefs, I have to say, when I've talked to chefs, they like hate cell phones at restaurants, because it's really taking away, from, you know, when that food's hot and that chef is calling it in the kitchen. I used to work in kitchens. I mean, they want it out the window. They want it on the table. And so phones in restaurants, I think, you know, it's tough because sometimes you need to. And I'm the first one to say, if, you know, it's a sitter, it's an emergency, you know, it's a campaign that's launching, like there's things that happen. But for the most part, I would encourage people to put them down, and it's surprisingly okay. In terms of, for me, how I balance, you know, when I was on the farm a few days a week, I still have some client obligations. I have things that I had to get through. I was going through a tough time, and I mean, I just think I make a list, and I just only do the things that are on it. There's a lot of, like, you know, websites you can do to block internet and stuff like that. I don't really do that, but, you know, I can sit and bank things out. I also really like the Pomodoro method, where you work in like chunks of 30 minutes and like take a break. So, I mean, I find for myself that I tie my productivity to really time boxing tasks I have to do, so then I can spend long periods of time offline and not feel bad about it. Yeah. Anything else? Questions? Comments?
Do you manage expectations people on each other and taking time off?
I didn't really. I mean, I just think you get your things done. I mean, it depends. You know, I've worked in offices for years, and I've worked remotely, and I just think you have to know, you just have to balance the two. So I sort of knew what days I had to get things done, and got them done. But I mean, I do think that there's a lot in, you know, the phrase like managing up, right? There's managing down, there's managing up. And I think that managing up would be for my clients. So like, for example, I like to write emails late at night, but I always put them in draft, and then I send them at 8 o'clock in the morning. I do not send any emails after like 6 or 7 p.m. until the morning. And I won't respond either, for the most part, unless it's an emergency, and then it's okay. But I just feel like draft them and send them during business hours, and it just starts to retrain. I mean, we're all a little bit like puppies that way. Like, we have to kind of get into a system that works for us. And so I think it's really important. And I'll say the same for my assistant or for people that are on my team. If you want to work late at night and send me things, that's great. You don't have to, but this is when I will be responding to you. Yes?
Just for something like that, do you set up an autoresponder then? I know that one of the, like for me, one of the reasons that I find myself checking my email late at night, or trying to respond quickly, is because I haven't told the person that's written to me that I wouldn't be doing it. I don't want to seem, if there's an excuse to not be there, the fact that I'm saying I'm putting my foot down at 7 o'clock, I won't be there. is different than them thinking I'm incompetent and not getting to their urgent whatever need it might be. Does that make sense?
I mean, it does. I guess I would want to, like, and you don't have to tell me right now more about like what you do and like what those things are, right? Because I've definitely worked on like a website launch, or there's like upcoming Giving Tuesday campaigns. I'm sure a bunch of us are in, or things that are like really coming to a head, and you have to, I think, alter and change that. And so there might be like a period of time where I'm more available, but I believe for the most part of setting some basic ground rules, because it really helps me as much as anything else. Like, there's certain times I need to be creative and do a big strategy or put together a fundraising campaign, and I need to have that time. So maybe I'm working at night, but I'm just not responding to emails.
You tell your clients though beforehand, like, oh, like I'm excited to be here, but like you should expect me to answer between the hours of like 7 to 7 p.m. and then from like 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. like for the most part I'm not available. Is that something you share up front, or it's
I mean, depending on who it is and what it is. I was working on a political referendum for November 4th, and so it was like a 6-week period where that was a little impossible. But, or I have a client I've worked with in the Congo, and so when I'm going to sleep, she's waking up. So I definitely had to say, like, when I see your emails, I'm sleeping, and I'll get to, so I do think it's on a case-by-case basis, especially depending on what the urgency is. Yeah.
There is a difference between wasting time creating things and consuming. You think there is a difference?
Yes. So I talked briefly about that consuming versus creating, and I think, that was just a huge aha moment for me when I was like, oh, if I'm creating something, I can spend all the time I want. But consuming, really thinking about limiting it, or at least acknowledging it. If I've had a really busy week and I just want to sit and watch Hulu, like that's fine, but I know that that's what I'm doing for those couple of hours versus reading a book or spending time with friends or doing something else. But one of the things on the farm that was really interesting is, even having been so like outdoorsy or camped or like, I had never been so physically tired, I don't think, not even traveling to some parts of like deep Africa on roads where there are no roads for hours at a time. It was really different. So I think one of the things I also learned was that physical exertion really helps me not want to have to be on the internet or do something else. And so that's one of the things that I still am like trying to channel or figure out now that I'm not on the farm anymore and I'm like back in New York life. Do I need to walk more? Do I need to spend more time in the gym? Like, what can I be doing to get to that physical exertion? Because sometimes I think that I was just choosing to consume information because I was in that in-between phase. You're not tired, you're not awake. So now I really try and like get myself to physical exertion every day. Yeah.
Yeah, just a comment. It seems like for the audience here, this is even more critical because in the nonprofit world, the staffing is lean, and we feel like we're so critical that it's important for us to be available and connected for an extended period of time. And I think it's really good to hear, because I think that the nonprofits can stop at a certain point and say, you're right, it's 7 p.m. and unless it's a fire, I'll deal with it in the morning.
And really there aren't that many things that are fires. I spent a decade in nonprofits or startups for social good where the world was on fire every day, the teams were lean, you were doing 100 things. And I had a horrible burnout. A really terrible, honest burnout where I was just, it was horrible. And when I came through that phase, which I did but I was like, I can't ever do that again because I'd spent so many years in so many environments where it was, and that was sort of almost before smartphones or, it's tough. It's really hard. But I do think it has to come from the top a little bit. I think the management, has to somehow come to a place where they understand this. And I think there's some education tools and, that's another reason for DinnerMode, if people can sort of bring up the conversation around putting down devices and talk about tech addiction. People sort of shake their head when they're like, yeah, I'm on my phone all the time, but is there that thought process behind all the other concepts? What else it's taking away from, not just the fact that you're always connected?
Crazy question, but how much do you think that working yourself to the brink of exhaustion and burnout is what enables you now to be in a position where you can tell yourself, I'm offline from 7 to 7 and everything else. When you're younger in your career, you feel like you kind of need to do that, especially in New York City. You need to almost bring yourself to a point of burnout to learn maybe this lesson, or to get yourself to a point in your career that you can look back and say, I am now established, I am now successful because of this ridiculous amount of work I just put in for the last 10 years. And now I can look back and say, you know what, no matter how big this client is, I'm offline at 7. Because when you're young and you're trying to get established, that client that you're trying to score, you almost get brownie points for not putting that response in a draft, right? You send the email, you almost look omnipotent, you look like they send you an email, you got a response from them. Any time of day, you're a workaholic, whatever it is, they're like, this guy's really doing that for me. So how much do you think of that front loading of your career actually paid off and is allowing you to do this now?
I think that that's such an interesting perception, and I don't mean that on you, but but you know, because for example, like, I didn't know this when I was in my 20s, and I also think that a lot of times in your 20s you can't really see past the end of your nose anyway. I mean, the world just seemed a little more myopic maybe. But now that I'm in my 30s, I know a lot of people that have children, and when they get those emails late at night, then they feel, you know, like the client that you're most likely trying to impress potentially is somebody that has a lot of other things going on, and maybe it's children, maybe it's a pet, maybe it's some other like passion point that they have, because people all choose different lives. But I think that culturally things are shifting. And I think that what used to be acceptable around we're always on, and that shows that we're omnipotent, and that means we're our A game, I think that's actually shifting to saying I know how to get things done in a average or uber average workday, and that's what makes me better, and that's what makes me kill it in my own way. And I think time will tell, but I think that that's shifting, because it used to be that way, but I just, you know, there's like articles now about kids in their mid-20s feeling like they're burning out. I mean, it's crazy, but if people are always on, what is that doing to us? And so I think time will tell, but.
I think there's also, I have a CFO who is very respectful of someone who gets their workday finished, and is out and in the elevator at 5:30. I mean, you know, he doesn't want to get an email at 6 or at 8 and stuff like that. To him, that's somebody who's not doing a good job if they have to be taking care of things in the off hours. There's a lot of respect that comes from a lot of high-level people if you can get your job done in that window of time. And you have to be performing. You know, you do have to establish something, but there's a certain something that comes from being able to do it within the window.
I mean, and some people like it, right? So if somebody, I mean, that's the whole thing, is like I try not to be hardline about it. If someone wants to work all hours and they love the fact that they're always connected, great. You know, if someone wants to be in that kind of work environment, I just think that there's a lot more other options out there, and certainly I didn't know about them, or I hadn't heard about them, and I had to find them on my own. And so that's sort of this, you know, concept to me. It's like, oh wow, I really wish that someone would have told me about this before.
Yeah.
Do you think, because maybe not now because the economy's been recovering, but when the economy's at the bottom, we were like trying to perform the same jobs with like a lot fewer people. So I think maybe it's getting better in the economy. Do you have any thoughts on that? How like is so many people laid off that we were still expected to get the same exact job done, like 3 less people, so you had to do all their jobs and work even more? Do you think the economy has anything to do with it?
I do. I also think it's a little bit industry specific. I mean, I've worked in places where you're rewarded based on the amount of emails that you're sending or receiving, you know. And then I remember I went to work at another place, and the first week I was like, did no one know I was hired? Like I couldn't understand why I wasn't getting hundreds of emails a day, but the emails I got were like longer, and instead of saying like, did you get that email or read this link, which is I think the worst, like there's nothing in it, it was like, hey, I found this interesting, here's what I found interesting about it, here's how I think it could apply to that thing, like what do you think? And the only emails that I got in that particular organization were more functional, and it was really amazing. So I think part of it could be economy, I think part of it could be industry oriented. I mean, we all have so much more to do, but to go back to that stat that I gave about the amount of hours that we're working, I mean, I just think it's remarkable because what are we necessarily getting for it, right? Like salaries aren't higher, wage inequality is not shifting at all, race or gender based. And I mean, I just think that there's a lot that we're giving up for this perceived notion of being on all the time.
I think that you have to be really clear, or I have to be really clear with the clients. Right now I'm doing consulting work, so when I'm writing a proposal and then we need to discuss it, I really kind of talk with them and say, you know, what are your expectations with these deadlines and what is, and you know, for me, I've already done the crazy. I'm not looking to do, you know, I'm not there anymore. I mean, I work very hard, but it's more, I'm more productive in the time management phase at this point. I just get more done in less time, so I don't need to be up, or like you, I won't, unless it's a deadline or something, I won't answer emails after a certain time. And if I'm in proposal and the client just seems crisis management focused, if I'm getting that, it's just kind of like, I'll just end it. I mean, it's loss of income and everything else, but it's also to protect my sanity, and I just don't want to go there anymore with, if you feel like, you know, I just ended a job where it was crisis management, it was just crisis after crisis, and they were manufactured. And I just said, I can't go there again if I'm getting that perception that it's just, I'm gonna, you know, at 9 o'clock I need a deadline, I just remember this, kind of like not going there anymore. So I think it's a personal, I mean, you have to define what works for you, and it becomes very much about a choice and about time management for me.
Yeah, I mean, I know it was really interesting this summer because people would see photos of like me farming, and they'd be like, when are you working? And I was like, well, I'm not taking a photo of me at the computer working. Like, that's not very, like, that's not showing up on my Instagram feed. That's not very interesting. You know, so I think that's another thing too, is like, you know, I feel like I got brownie points for like looking like I wasn't really working this summer, even though I was, first of all, working harder than I've ever worked in my whole life, number one, and number two, getting a killer amount of stuff done. And all my clients were thrilled with the work, but it was interesting. It was like I'd never really felt, it was fascinating. I felt like I was getting all these points for like seeming like I was not at a desk all the time. Yeah. Yes.
Two questions. The first one about yoga. Is this informed by yoga or mindfulness, that kind of stuff? The concepts?
A little bit. I mean, so I'm a wannabe meditator. I wouldn't even say burgeoning because I just think that to me indicates like you're going to get there. And but you know, they say like 5 minutes a day makes this huge difference, and it does all these things for you. And so I do think that idea, you know, I took that idea of like what else could you do in 5 minutes, or what else could you do if you set time aside to change a behavior, or I think behavior modification and change, like I'm so endlessly curious about lots of things about how we function and operate and treat each other and what's happening in the world. And so I do think that it came a little bit from that. But sort of like I spoke about, one of the things, having worked in rural, urban, international populations, something that's accessible. I know I talked about food, but not a ton about quality of food. I totally acknowledge that in places like food deserts, the food choices are horrible. A lot of people in poverty don't have access to food, but that idea of needing food and having some part of the day that's around food came from it. So I would say yes, certainly in some ways, and then sort of tweaked it to what I thought would be a broader appeal.
And then, I like the stats about how it affects children, the Walt Disney example. Is this something, are you particularly interested in children and the implications? For instance, like young children, when young children are spending time on screens, then they don't like build their vocabulary, learn speech, or they have like developmental issues as a result. So I was wondering if that was an interest.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, just to be sensitive to the fact that a lot of people have to work 2 jobs. A lot of people are one parent households, or even if they're both. I mean, people, you know, I felt like a lot of the things that were happening around food to me felt a little elitist and a little big city, and I wanted that I felt I could have this conversation in a lot of different places with a lot of different people. So I'm a little cautious on the children thing, because I think that for a lot of parents that are in very tough situations, it's really easy for them to hand a kid a device, and I don't want to judge that choice, not knowing their personal situations, because it's very easy for the Steve Jobs, Jack Dorsey, you know, to say that they're not giving their kids devices and that they have healthy food on the table every night. So I think that it's just, for me, an important, you know, misnomer or part that I want to mention. However, that being said, I think that the conversations around children should absolutely be applied to us. So like when I mentioned about the Steve Jobs, it's like, why do we talk about all this stuff for children and we're not talking about our own issues when we then know that they're mimicking us? I mean, they're such mimics of what we do. So yeah, I mean, I do think it's really interesting with children and what's happening with kids. I also think it's just as important for us. And for me, again, it's just really paramount to remember that everybody has their own really unique situations. All right, I'm here. If you have any other questions, please feel free to come up and say hi. Is there anything else? Thank you. Thank you.